The following session, Bringing Communicative Techniques into the Classical Language Classroom, Examples, Myths, and Methods, will be presented by Mr. John James, who is a PhD student in classics at SUNY Buffalo, where he researches ancient Greek grammarians and poetics and teaches classical languages and literature. Please welcome Mr. James.
Hello, thank you all for coming. Like was stated, my topic here is bringing communicative techniques into the classical language classroom. We'll talk about what exactly that means. Basically, I want to split this into two parts. Let me see if this works. Yes. First of all, a demonstration in Greek. Hellenistis in Greek. I thought it'd be less likely to have people already knowing Greek. So that way you Latin teachers can learn a little too. We will switch to talking a little more theoretically about what exactly communicative language learning is. Just very briefly, the theory behind it and really what the main points are. See how that resonates and harmonizes with classical language learning. And then I want to give you guys some ideas. Some ideas of how to bring some things into your classroom. Little things that you might be able to change or do or think about you might think would work well in your classroom. We'll try and get through a lot of them. We probably won't have room for time to get through all these, but we'll touch on them. And then just encouragement to try them out, basically. I think they can really resonate with classical pedagogy and bring more life into those dead languages. So, so the first part, demonstration. Let's start with a little quote from Aristotle. He says, "Ha garde mathontas poien, tauta poiuntes manthanomen." What does this mean? For whatever we have to learn to do, we learn to do by doing. Right? So we're going to begin by actually doing some Greek here. So bear with me, try and learn along with this, and we'll see what we can do. So, Kaire. Ego emi Ioannes. Ego emi Ioannes. 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 Ioannes Jakobos. Jakobos. Tis a su.
Ego emi Andreas.
Nice. Su e Andreas. Andreas. Kalista. Right. Ego emi Ioannes, su e Andreas. Tis e su.
Ego emi.
Su e Jesus. Ego emi Ioannes, su e Jesus, su e Andreas. Jaire. E su.
Ego emi Anna.
Anna. Su e Anna. Kalista. Kalista. Ti est in tuto. Ti est in tuto. Udamos. Tuto est in calamos. De calamos. Tuto est in calamos. Es in calamos mu. Uc est in calamos su. Ti est in tuto.
En calamos.
No, es in calamos su. Calamos su. Calista. Calamos. Ti est in tuto.
Biblios.
Biblos, es sind mega Biblos? Es sind Biblion. Biblion. Es sind, das sind Biblion. Nein, hier sind Tutor.
Tutas dan Biblianmu.
Nein, Biblion su ist die. Nein, kennst du Biblion? Udamos.
Mus.
Su ist in Biblion. Biblion. Alles da.
Es den Diabolus.
Es del
Es sind
telefono.
Telefonon. Nein, Omega. Telefonon. Telefonon. Es sind Telefonon. Telefonon. Hier sind Heire. Ego emi Ioannes.
Ergo mia Brian.
Brianos. Brianos. Heire. Hier sind Tutor. Es sind Telefonon. Es sind Telefonon su. Kalesta. Oder, Tiastin?
Es den Kalamos.
Kalamos, das ist su. Labe, Kalamon mu. Kai Tiastin tuto?
Es den Telefonum.
Es sind Telefonon mu. Labe, Telefonon mu. Labe. Kai,
Biblio.
Es den Biblion.
Biblion mikron. Labe. Oana. Biblion. Kalista. Nun. Dos moi to Kalamon. Dos moi Kalamon.
Uk. Kalamos ist den Mu.
Oh, dos moi und Kalamon su.
Uk.
Kai su. Dos moi telefonon mu. Karen soy. Kai dos moi to Biblion. To Biblion mu. Karen soy. Nun, Iesu. Dos to Kalamon su to Andreo. Hello, sorry. Kai su o Andrei. Dos to Biblion su to Ana. Carlos. Nein. Kai yun tiakes. Oh, ties in tuto. Es in Poterion. Poterion. Dos Poterion su to presbutero to su Calista. Calista. Close. Nein. Apodos to Biblion to Andreo. Apodos. Nein. To auto. Nein. Kai dos moi to Poterion. Kai ego diromi soi to Poterion. Kai apodos moi to Kalamon. Tu Jesu. To Kalamon tu Jesu. Ego diromi soi to Kalamon su. Gracias. Yes, Karen. Nein, Karen soy. Karen. Nein, justo. Calista. Nein, die una curte. Tis eni. Johannes. Nein, Carlos. Tis Jesu.
Ja, ego emi Andreas.
Ego emi Andrea. Ego. Nein. Ti estin tuto.
Potere.
Nein, estin poterion mu. Oder mo?
Uk.
Mu. Su estin poterion. Nein, estin poterion su. Nein. Kai diromi to Kalmon. No. Ilego. Dos moi to Kalmon. Utos. Moi. Dos moi. Kaisa. No. Ego emi Johannes. Tis Su Jesus, kai su Andreas, kai su Anna. Nein, kai tuto estin telefonon mu. Tuto estin telefonon su. Kai dos moi Kalamon. Ala ego didomi soy. Didomi soy. Nein. Ti un. Neonti. Aha. Tis estin hutos.
Jesus.
Hoc estin Jesus? Tis estin?
Johan.
Johannes e Johannes.
Baptistes.
Udemos, nai hutos estin Johannes ho baptistes. Johannes ho baptistes. E Johannes ho prodromos. Drame. Pro Nein. Casa. Johannes estin. Times hutoi.
Presbyteroi.
Presbyter. Pharisaioi eisen. Pharisaioi. Judaioi. Pharisaioi. Sun etin. Nein. Judaioi. Pharisaioi. Nein. Kai ti po usin. Oi Pharisaioi erotosin to Ioanne. Ti erotosin. Tis Jesu. Tis Jesu. Nein, su Anna. Kai tis Jesu.
Andreas.
Nein, Carlos. Kai su. Jesus. Alla ti lege ho Ioannes. Ti apokrinetai. Otas tis Jesu legus in hoi Judaioi, hoi Pharisaioi, kai lege ho Ioannes. Ego uk emi ho Christos. Tis ho Christos? Ho Christos. Uk ho Jesus Christos. Tis Jesu, kai su uk ho Christos. Ego uk emi ho Christos. Ti un. Su Elias erotos in ho Judaioi. Su Elias. Tis Elias.
Elias.
And the first move, Elias. Tis Elias. Prophetes estin. Nein, prophetes. Nein. Elias. Legus in hoi Pharisaioi. Su Elias, Ti lege ho Ioannes.
Mi u.
Ukeni. Ukeni. Ti ud. Ho prophetes erotosin hoi parsai. Ho prophetes. Ti lege ho Ioannes. Ti ud. Tis a. Tis a. Tis a. I apakrinatai. Ego phone bontos ente remo. Ti tutto. Ti tutto semai. Ego phone. Bontos ente remo. Uke sena. Ente remo. Hode. Yedu. Kaista. Tell us. No. So we basically read a slightly adapted portion of John 1. Just most of what I omitted was just, and he said and they said, right? And which you could have understood from context. Just to keep it streamlined, I took it out. So now we'll take a little time to reflect on what was going on. What the point of that is, and exactly what's helpful or not, and the sort of theory behind it. So the point is to get to a point where you can read the text and understand what it says as you're reading, like you would in English, right? So as a communicative text that is telling you something, right? So let's just talk a little bit about the theory part. So here's the outline again. We're in the second part. What is communicative language learning? And then we'll talk about some techniques that you could easily just fill in little things. So, all right. So first of all, what is communicative language learning? So communicative approaches emphasize the central place of communication in second language acquisition. Second language acquisition, SLA, is the field of linguistics that's concerned with language learning and also teaching language learning. So this sort of approach to language learning has about, I'm summarizing it down into three kind of main characteristics. The first part is it includes environmental factors paired with an understanding that humans have an innate ability and capacity for language. I think we can resonate with a lot of that there. And really the environmental factors is that you need the language situation needs to be comprehensible, at least to a large degree. Right? There might be a little bit that you have to learn as you're talking, but for the most part it needs to be comprehensible, understandable, and that's where you get this idea of comprehensible input that you hear people talk about all the time. Right? Oftentimes abbreviated to just CI. Okay? So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the following slides. The second part is that implicit automatic proficiency in the language is actually related to explicit knowledge of the language. So there's different language learning models that say there's no connection between knowing grammar and actually being able to speak the language. Usually communicative approaches say that they do interface at some level, but they don't do the same thing. Right? So there is some interaction between them, but they're not the same thing. Right? And actually what you mainly focus on is the automatic proficiency in the language that then leads to an ability to explicitly state the language rules. So we'll, again, look at that and a little bit more. And then the last thing that I'm not going to talk about very much is that most communicative approaches agree that there is a specific progression of grammatical acquisition in a language that you can't override. And usually that starts out with commands and then builds to first, second person interactions and on to narrative and so on and so forth. And all of the grammatical features that go along with that. We can talk about that more later, but I won't really focus on that very much today. So if you want, so the main thing, again, takeaway from this is that the goal of language learning is actually communication. Right? Whether you're speaking, or writing, or reading, or listening, you're wanting to know what it means. That's a good Lutheran question. What does this mean, right? And this, I think, is pretty logos-centric, right? And if I, if I write this word on the board, duck, like the bird. This is not what the Greeks would call a logos. This would be a lexis, just something that you physically said. But if I write duck, that means something. That's a complete thought. And so for Aristotle, a logos could be anything from a single word that has meaning to the whole Iliad or the whole Odyssey, which holds together as a unified speech utterance that means something. Right? So that's kind of a tangent. But the point is that when we're using language, we're wanting to communicate. We're wanting to know what it means. And this applies also to ancient texts, where really we want to read them and understand them. That's what it boils down to. So if you want to learn a little bit more about the theoretical side of communicative approaches, this book is really good by Jennifer Noonan. It's very densely linguistic, but it has a lot of different facets. And then it talks about specifically applying these to biblical languages, but also just ancient languages, where the main point is to read. So she mentions Latin. So, if you're interested in doing any of this, how can you actually bring communicative language learning features into the classroom? How can you, if you're teaching Latin, how can you bring some more sort of techniques that use Latin as Latin to say something? Okay? So let's look at some of these. One of the things that we just tried is immersion, right? And you'll notice that what went along with that was a lot of dialogue. So this is kind of the most conspicuous part of a normal classroom that's a communicative approach, that you conduct the class or parts of the class solely in the target language. That's the language you want to learn, the target language. And you put everything, what this does is it puts everything into a communicative context. You can't do class unless you are communicating meaningful utterances to each other, and you understand. Right? You can't give me your book unless you understand what I mean. If you want to give me your book. Yeah. And so and there's also so this can be to different levels, right? A little bit of this can go a long way. You can make little things in your classroom communicative in Latin this way, right? So greetings, I think a lot of people do that, salve, right? Salvete. But you can also expand that to manners you have to use all the time. Excuse me, we had thank you, right? And more things like that. Just classroom instructions. If you had to say, turn to page, whatever in your textbook. I mean, you have to say that every day. Like, you'll know the verb for turn. You'll know the form for the imperative to turn. And you will know the accusative case, right? But you can also parse. and do comprehension questions and do other things in the language, right? Saying, quo casu est, what case is it in? Right? And then you've heard, if you do that every single class, you've heard the ablative of the fifth declension. Way before you learn the fifth declension, right? Yeah, a little bit of this can go a long way. And I think sometimes people go off the other side and they're like, well, you know, if you're talking about grammar, that isn't a real communicative situation. Well, it is. Teaching is a communicative situation, right? Asking what case something is a real communication, right? So this can be adapted a lot, but again, a little bit goes a long way. You might allow your students to respond in English, and then you might retranslate into whatever language if you feel comfortable with that, or just readings and things like that. But what you do with that is you're just making more of it, more of your classroom, a conversation, more dialogical. Right? And really a big part of a Socratic dialogue is this personal connection. And you see this with Socrates when he runs into a Thrasymachus who doesn't really want to have a dialogue. He just wants to win. And he doesn't connect with what he actually thinks, and he's willing to address those. Right? That's completely different than if he runs into a Meno, who he can guide along to actually want to learn what he's actually talking about. And so having this dialogical focus allows you to do that, right? And it also allows you to wake up students by talking to them directly. It's always back and forth, question answer. And then that makes Plato easier to read later on. And it also shows that master-apprentice relationship, where you're sure the teacher knows more, but the teacher is also just one step ahead, leading the student along, right? Maybe just a lot of times for us teachers, we are just like half a step ahead. But it shows you're always modeling exactly what your student is going to do next, right? And so it's not just information download, but guidance there. And then a clear benefit of this is just that you get more of the target language. Right? You get more of Latin, that is, or Greek, or whatever. Maybe you're teaching Hebrew. If you say hello in Latin, already that's a time that you would have spent in English in Latin instead, where they're getting real Latin words. Right? That is more comprehensible input to put in the technical terms, and hopefully your students are more engaged. And that's definitely been my experience. Next thing. This is always a question. How do you do grammar then? Because we want to do grammar, because we all love grammar. So we saw a little bit of how this can work. I did a very short, really way too fast of a demonstration of this. But the basic idea is you start with the comprehensible and the communicable, the implicit introductions of the form. So we said ego, emi, su, es in biblion mu, es in biblion su, all these things that you could just understand because you knew what was going on. Right? And then if this were a real class, I'd have everyone do it. There's a few too many people here for that to get through it. And then, so you'd all have formed the words with your mouth and had to think about what it means. Or else you couldn't do what the teacher told you to do. Right? But then this leads to the extraction of patterns and then explicit instruction. Right? So that's what we did here. So basically here we learned some pronouns and some cases, which is way too much to do it all at once. I would do that a lot slower in a classroom, one case at a time, but I knew you guys could handle it because they were all teachers. So, and then we could even go from this out of lepes me. You see me, lepes me. Then maybe you want to go faster too. All right, so we have ego, mu, moi, me, su, soy. What do you think? Say. It's so. All right, now we can move on to the next. That's the accusative case. There you go. But what this is first of all, you have a communicative introduction of the form, right? And you can do this in a number of different ways, right? So we use basically what's called total physical response, where you have our TPR, which is you have students do things with their bodies, right? So even if they can't articulate the words yet, they can focus on the meaning of what it is, right? And they can still follow instructions, etc. You could also have a dialogue, right? If you're further along, well, kind of like what we did. We had a little dialogue, right? I asked you questions, you answered. You could have a story, a text to introduce a form, or even just a game that uses the form that you want to use, but it's clear what's going on, right? Simon Says, right? Get a bunch of imperatives, and then you extract the imperatives. So that's the next step. And really, I think that this is central to, then you ask the students to recognize the forms. You ask them, what just happened? What happened grammatically? Right? So then you slowly build the paradigms you need to have, right? And you get to the grammar. Okay? Now, I think that this is really the heart of Ars Grammatica, where this is really teaching and bringing students along to recognize their language and see what the features of a language are, or in this case, whatever language they're learning, right? And this is really what you need for careful reading. You don't, if you just memorize the paradigms and have this rote information, that gets you somewhere. But you need to be able to apply that, and this sort of process where you extract the linguistic information. If you teach students to do that, then they can apply that anywhere. Right? They can apply it to English or Latin or the next language they learn. Right? I think this really resonates with Dr. Veith mentioned in the plenary the heuristic approach to where you learn observation, basically, and find out those universals, right? And here, it isn't universal, but it's universal in Greek, right? So, and you mathematicians, does this look like anything? This sort of, to me, this looks a little bit like Euclid, where you have, I want to do this. And if you think about that for a while, you have to, that gets you thinking, how can I do that, right? And then you go through your skills, gather your information, and then eventually you can build your knowledge from there, the explicit knowledge. And that always needs to be followed up with some reinforcement, right? We know this, and no matter how we approach language learning, you have to have review, repetition, reinforcement. So it's best, I think, if you can also make those reviews meaningful, basically. So communicative reinforcement, you focus on exercises and drills that use the forms you want, because you are learning specific things in the language, specific constructions, but in a meaningful context. Right? So what are some examples of how to do this? Right? You can read, right? You can have a real story that in order to understand it, you have to know the forms, right? You could also have writing assignments, spoken answers. You could just ask a bunch of questions, even games or some drills. If you want to just be a very dry drill, would be something like this. So what I would do is, this is in Latin, so we're switching to Latin, right? Sure. Yeah. So I would first of all do this without the students seeing it, right? then I would be like, hic est calamos, video calamum, right? So if you've learned the accusative case, now you're drilling it, right? Video calamum, right? Then you say, hic est liber, video librum, yeah, what's next? Hic est, over there, hic est porta, haec est porta, right? Videmus porta, right? And so you see, you can do this, and then what you can do is you can hand these out in pairs. You can have students do them back and forth together, and then they can take them home, fold them in half, and then quiz themselves, right? and all that, if they're really, really motivated. Right? But he also knows. I just did this. We have calamum, second declension, first declension. But all the accusatives in Latin just end in M. Accusative singular. Easy. So throw in sedes, chairs. Throw in a chair. Why not? They can learn whatever declension you want in whatever it is, day 2, when they're learning the accusative. Right? So that's, so again, what's the point? The point is to make the connection between the form and the meaning automatic. That's really what all these drills are about, is to then be like, okay, anytime I say Guido, I'm going to add that M on the end. And just do it so many times that it's automatic. Right? Anytime I need a direct object, it's going to be in the accusative. Right? And you have just tons of repetition to make that just second nature, basically. Yeah, should check time. I go until a half hour? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Cool. Okay. Yeah, so another thing is pre-reading. So we did some of this. How do you then get to primary text? And really the key, I think, is pre-reading. Progressively preparing your student to read a primary source comprehensively, like we did, basically. Right? We had, how can you do this? Okay, so pre-reading activities, we could do that total physical response, act out things. You know, if Paul's going on a missionary journey, you have your students travel around or something and narrate that. Storytelling, dialogue. So what we did was dialogue, right? We say, who are you? I'm so-and-so. And then we could read that passage from 1 John. Another great thing is describing a picture. If you have, like John the Baptist, we could have gone back and described his camel hair and his belt, and if he was eating something, that would have helped. But and then we could have read that passage, right? But you're preparing your students then to read an original text, or maybe an adapted text, right? And you could do a writing activity to prepare for a text, but that's usually better for reinforcement after you read something, to then imitate it like a progymnosmata sort of thing. I think it was Dr. Veith who mentioned this. The goal isn't to get into an academic debate, but to go ad fontes. Ad fontes. Right? So you want to be able to participate in those academic debates. What sort of genitive are we dealing with in whatever? But first, you just want to read the text and understand it, right? And that's the first goal, right? And then you extract and learn how to, in whatever situation you are, make judgments about correct usage and what's actually happening with the formal usage of the language. I think this approach can really make primary sources accessible pretty quickly. And actually, in general, no matter what approach you're using, there are easy texts out there. They might not be the highest literature, but there are real sources of Latin that you can bring into first year Latin, Greek, Hebrew. And I highly recommend finding those and using them because it does make the path clear. It's again kind of the master apprentice thing that you see what you're going towards. You're going towards reading the Bible. And I don't know, the little experience I've had teaching in a Lutheran school, that's usually the only, the class that you can depend on students to be interested in. They understand, all right, we're reading the Bible now, no more messing around. Well, this is important. And if you can bring that in, that's great. So stair stepping up with these pre-readings can turn that into it'll still be a challenge. It'll still be hard. But it'll be a little more pleasant, a little more achievable, and not just, all right, now I have another chunk of Latin that I have to translate, and then once I'm done, I can be done with it. Rather, you end with a text that you've read, and you can reread and understand it every time. So, which leads to something else, extensive reading. What is extensive reading? Like you can do this in more of like a book club style. A lot of this resonates with what Katie Marigaglia was talking about with the Picta Dicta curriculum, and also so having reinforcement with just a lot of easy texts that tell a real story, right? And that can just reinforce those forms very quickly. I think that's a really important part. I'm not going to talk about it a whole lot, partially because Bryce Hedstrom last year had a whole section on it, and he did a lot about that. But here's his website, and there's a Latin tab there with a lot of information on extensive reading. I think that's something that, and texts and books and everything for Latin. So if you want more about that, I would suggest going there. Yeah. But again, the point is that you have easy texts that are comprehensible. It's built-in repetition, but you're really doing something with the language. And this, I think, is the best way to build vocabulary. Because flashcards can be tedious. You can do fun things with flashcards. But if you learn to read and just pick up vocabulary as you go, you just keep using that, right? That's what we do in English all the time, even as we're growing older. So, and that this again focuses on the automatization of the language, where you pick it up immediately in the target language, Latin or Greek, right? So this is there are things for beginners. I think that this is great for any level. Like if you're advanced, you're going to be reading stuff, I hope. But I think it's especially good for what we call the intermediate plateau, where you've been learning grammar and you get through all the declensions, all the conjugations and the subjunctive, and then you just don't have any new things, and you're still not that great at Latin, and you're still struggling, right? And you feel like you're not learning new stuff, you're not progressing, which really you are. You're just growing and needing more reinforcement, right? And what's really kind of the antidote to that is new stuff, new content, right? So reading a lot of things that you actually learning new content because you don't have new forms maybe to learn, or not as many new forms that come up. So I mean that could be new literature, new stories, poetic forms, meters, all that stuff, which is a lot of fun too. Yeah. Yes. So extensive reading is great. Check out Bryce Hedstrom for more Latin stuff. And maybe something that this is kind of what I think. Yeah, if there's like one thing you can maybe pull out of this and apply to any of and no matter what sort of classroom you have or curriculum that you have to use, I think there's a lot of good ways you can adjust assessments to be a little bit more focused on Latin than than maybe just translating. So a communicative assessment tool is intended to precisely gauge a specific meaningful element of the language. Right? So, I mean, this is how most assessments are intended to be set up. But I think it's a little more precise than just translating from the L2 to L1. That's the second language to your native language, right, to your first language. And it helps keep that target language, whatever you're learning, as the main goal. So what happens what potentially happens when you just translate from the language you're trying to learn back into English is, again, you have that idea where it's like, well, once I'm done with that, I've cracked the code and I can be done with the Latin, right? And that's not the goal. Or if at higher levels, maybe you've prepared your translation and you memorize your translation for the test, right? And you don't really, you've left the Latin behind for half a semester, and to prepare for the test, you just review your own translation, or someone else's translation, or some AI's translation, right? If it's really bad. So, how can you get around some of that? So there's a number of different ways. Consider for vocabulary, if you're working with vocabulary, doing matching stuff, maybe a lot of you are doing this already. You can match synonyms in the target language, right? And you don't have to go back into English. You can match opposites, and this helps grow and connect words together to sort of expand your Latin world and make sure you're building a firm foundation in vocabulary. You can also have comprehension in context. So if you have a reading passage on your text, in your test, you can underline certain words and be like, what does this mean? Right? What does this mean? And again, the point is not just to give an English class, which will never be adequate for everything that a Latin word means. Right? But find a way to have the student show you they know the Latin. You know? It's like, in that case. For forms, I think fill in the blanks can be really good. So if I say, tis a, and I just leave that blank, right? But we've said that however many millions of times. That's just a phrase they have in their head. So like, they can write soup, right? So you can have just a page of all these phrases that you've learned in class, right? And with fill in the blanks, right? Also using paradigms in context. So rather than just having a paradigm page, you can have sentences that get at the paradigm, right? So, I didn't. See the goat, hear the goat, I am the goat. In Greek, that would use so it would be, ide ton aiga, that's the accusative. Akuo, to listen to. Akuo, that takes the genitive. To aigos, ego emi ho aikes, right? So you would use the goat, yeah. So you would use that would make your students write the genitive, or the accusative, then the genitive, and the nominative forms, right? And you could use different words, of course, but then it's clear what the context is, what that form does in a sentence, right? Two of them are objects, and then one's a nominative predicate, but So you can sort of expand that. I've also just like to make the paradigm chart like that. Right? You just say, idu, behold, and then you have the nominative. You say blepo, and then you have the accusative, akuo. Then you have the genitive, and then dido mi to telefono. I give the phone, 2, and then you have the dative. So you can make a chart just like that. And if your students want to then go back and go, what's the whole sentence? They have a context for it. Yeah, so that's another idea. So for assessing reading ability, rather than just translating, I think comprehension questions are great. That's what we do for English reading, right? Maybe you guys have some more ideas on that. And this may seem daunting, but the little that I've done with this has always, students always surprise. They're just really creative. and especially if from the start you stress that, well, this kind of goes into the second part, just composition in general. Doing any sort of, even translation from English into Latin is great. And students don't know that's harder than the other way, unless you tell them that, basically. And really, it does encourage a lot of creativity, and it's I think a welcome challenge to a lot of students. It's the rest is just kind of why do we have to crack another code? But here I can make something. Especially if you use a pop song or something, something that they know really well, and then it seems like it'd be really absurd to have it in Latin, right? Or in Greek, telephone. That's absurd. But and this kind of gets into basically any sort of composition is a really great way to holistically assess how your students are doing, right? As a sort of end goal. So if you've read a bunch of Aesop's fables, probably simplified Aesop's fables in Greek, and then you imitate that. So for what we did today, after going back and forth, then have every pair of students ask each other their names and do it back and forth, read a little dialogue, you'd read the John passage, and then you'd write your own as homework. You'd have to write it down, reinforce it. And maybe it's, between Hercules and the Hydra or something. It can be absurd, but then that's a great reinforcement. And based off of that classical idea of mimesis, imitation, right? So fables and all those other things. And there are ancient Greek textbooks if you want to do Greek. So there are very old textbooks that have that all set up for you already. Yeah. How are we doing for time? We're getting towards the end. So, this is basically where we'll conclude. The communicative tools, these help engage your students, I think, and concentrate the classroom activity in all its facets on using the language as a language. Right? So, I hope maybe you're inspired. You've seen a few things that could be useful. Again, just take it slow. Try a few things. I hope you're maybe motivated to try some of these things, or try them yourself, just to work on your own language ability. And buona fortuna. Thank you. Yeah. I think we have some time for questions. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So, I assume you are familiar with immersive curriculum,
Yeah.
What is your? Because this seems to be almost exactly going along with that, or is there a difference between?
So it's a similar approach, for sure. Like I said, this is kind of building off of an earlier sessional by Katie Maragalia, who talked about the Picta Dicta curriculum. So that's, so I would, Lingua Latina can be hard to start out, really hard to start out. And especially if you don't have much ability, like if you're not practiced with it, with speaking yourself in the language, it can be tough to jump into as a teacher. So Picta Dicta really helps build you up towards that. And so, yeah, and I think a lot of these sort of more dialogical approaches, they can be great for getting started before Lingua Latina. And then once you get there, then you already have some reading ability. And you can jump into Roma in Italia est and all that stuff, yeah. But, yeah, that's it. Yeah. Yes.
How did you train yourself to be conversational in Greek or Latin?
Well, I didn't train myself, but yeah. So I went to the Polis Institute in Jerusalem for a couple years and learned ancient Greek and Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, just in this way. They just do immersive ancient language learning. And then I'd already studied the Greek and Latin at Hillsdale College, so I had a very firm grammatical foundation already, which was great. And then I just kind of applied that to Latin and have mostly just done Latin on my own. But there's a lot of these things apply to teaching yourself, especially extensive reading is really, really important for that. And then just trying to listen, talk as much as you can. Take approach and non-assumptive approach, and try to imitate the authors. And yeah, so many in various ways. Yeah.
What kind of maintenance do you do for yourself in those languages?
For myself, well, I'm a grad student in classics, so I read Latin and Greek every day. And
do you do it out loud, or is it pretty much just a book?
Sometimes. So I try to also read a little bit of Homer and the New Testament, and sometimes you just have to read Homer out loud.
And do you do all three languages, or is there kind of one you?
In some form or another, yeah, all three. But mainly reading for maintenance, and then I have a few friends who I can talk to. But yeah, but there could be more. I could have more friends. That would be great. Yeah.
Since we're obviously communicating this all out, what do you think about how we pronounce ancient?
For Latin, we won't talk about Greek.
Talking about ecclesiastical Latin,
Yeah.
it's a separate thing altogether, but just ancient.
Yeah, no,
How we decide on vowels and long length of vowels, things like that.
Oh yeah, so that's awesome. For the poetry, the long and short vowels are essential, right? And the best way to learn them is by doing them. Yeah. Okay. So the best way to learn them, that essential part of the poetry, is to learn the poetry, really, to recite the poetry as it would be, and that's how you practice the pronunciation. I think there can be a lot of fights about pronunciation. In my experience, once with Latin and Greek, once you get into it enough and you've interacted with people who use both, it's not that big of a hurdle. It really isn't. And what's more important is just to be using the languages and talking to people. And we'll always, this was something I was thinking of putting in here, like that we can actually reconstruct ancient pronunciation, like, accurately enough that for that any of us can actually achieve that level. And so that's not really the issue. The main thing is, I think, pedagogical, and to just have a consistent pronunciation, and to all be striving towards excellence in pronunciation. So that's going to take time for different people, especially the vowel quantities. That's so different from what we're used to in English,
Right.
right? Saying insula with a long A at the end, right?
Right.
For the ablative, right? But that just takes a lot of practice, and eventually you do start to hear it, and then eventually,
Since you're in
after
grad school,
lots
could
of
you write
practice.
a paper on this for us? Finish tonight.
Yeah, I can give you some suggestions of things about this. Yeah, for sure. Any other questions or? Oh, yes.
Are you aware of any immersive curricula that is aimed at church words? Like lingua latina is not. Roma. Can we do something like Wittenberg is in, or, you know, does something like that exist?
Not that I know of. There's, I think a lot of you already do what would be the first thing, right? Is to memorize some stuff in Latin, the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, all that. Kind of on a level kind of after lingua latina, after the first one, Familia Romana, there is some stuff by the Vivarium Novum. There are biblical narrations.
Yeah, Carfagni, Roberto Carfagni.
Okay, yeah.
He is also doing this stuff.
Okay.
Novum Testamentum, whatever.
Yeah.
I can't remember the
Yeah.
exact title of it now. But if you look up that name, you'll be able to find like biblical stories that are
Yeah.
structured the same way.
Yeah. So there are a lot of like readers that are at different levels out there, especially for Latin. But as Stephen Krycho mentioned in an earlier thing, you can get into the Vulgate pretty quick if you choose good narratives that are pretty simple, or that they've already heard in chapel or something. Any other questiones? That was fun.